Whenever you open Audacity, it automatically generates a new blank project for you. A project is where you create, import, or edit your audio files. A project can be a single track, or it can contain multiple tracks that play simultaneously. But the project doesn't just contain your audio files. It also stores information about what you've done to the files, such as their pan position in the stereo mix, their volume level or gain, the names you've given your tracks, and several other pieces of data. Let's take a look at how to set up a new project. I'm going to close this project that opened when I opened Audacity, and we'll start fresh by choosing File, New. And that opens up a new blank project. But of course you need to know a little bit more than that. Let's go to Audacity Preferences, or Edit Preferences if you're on Windows. And here select the Quality category. And what I want to look at here is the sampling area. Notice here that you can select the default sample rate and the sample format. Together, these settings affect the quality of your projects. Now, I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but this is important stuff to understand, so bear with me for a moment. Let's start by talking about sample rate. So, sound is a continuous entity or wave. When we capture audio digitally, which is what we're doing when we record into a computer, we're not really capturing every single moment of the sound. What we're doing is capturing samples of the sound. Just as a video camera doesn't capture every single moment of motion, it captures frames, but it captures enough frames per second, generally 24 to 30 frames per second, that when those images are played in sequence, we have the illusion of motion. So when you record a sound, the frames in this case are called samples. The more samples you can collect per second, the more accurate the sound will sound when you play it back. The speed at which these samples are collected is called the sample rate. For example, the standard sample rate of a standard music CD is 44,100 Hz, or 44.1 kHz. That means that for every second of music, what you're really hearing is 44,100 samples of the music, which is acceptable to the majority of people in terms of sound fidelity. So in Audacity, the default sample rate is 44.1. You can see there's a wide range of choices here, but generally you're going to stick to 44.1 or possibly 48,000 Hz, which is the sample rate commonly used for audio that accompanies video. Bear in mind that the higher the sample rate, the larger your files are going to be. If you have the hard drive space to spare, many people recommend going as high as 96,000 Hz. But most people can't hear the difference between 44.1, 48, and 96 kHz. So unless you're producing audio for some real audio files, I would stick to the default of 44.1. But now you know where to change this default if you need to. Now the other setting here is the default sample format. This is also commonly called the bit depth. Notice we have the choices here of 16-bit, 24-bit, and 32-bit float. The bit depth determines the dynamic range of your audio file. The more bits, the wider the range of volume you can have within each sample of your recording. So I just compared the sample rate to a camera that takes thousands of images of sound per second. Again, for example, a sample rate of 44.1 kHz takes 44,100 samples per second. The amount of information stored in each one of those samples is determined by the bit depth. So for example, a low bit depth, like 8-bit resolution, really is not enough to accurately capture the dynamic range of most sounds. A 16-bit resolution, which is how most music CDs are encoded, allows for a much wider dynamic range. 24-bit gives you an even larger range, and 32 is the current limit of where Audacity can go. Many modern computers these days can support 64-bit audio, although at this time it's not widely supported in very many audio recording software programs. So the higher your bit depth, the more information or dynamic range you have to work with. Higher bit depths also result in larger files though. But unless you're working with an old computer with very little hard drive space to spare, you should always work at the highest bit depth possible, which is 32-bit float. When you're done, you can always come back in here to convert your project to a lower bit depth if you want to decrease the file size, or for example, burn a CD, for which you'll have to drop your bit depth down to 16-bit. But it's best to work with the highest resolution file while editing. Now the reason it's labeled 32-bit float is because this isn't true 32-bit recording. 32-bit float is actually a 24-bit resolution recording with an additional 8 bits for headroom and dynamic range. And currently you won't find many computers that come with 32-bit sound cards or 32-bit input-output devices for computers. Most of the highest quality devices are still 24-bit, and Audacity uses 32-bit float to get the optimum sound quality and dynamic range out of your 24-bit hardware. Again, this is kind of technical, but the bottom line is, use 32-bit float for your recordings to get the best dynamic range. You can always convert it down later, but you'll never be able to get more quality out of a recording that was recorded at a lower bit rate. So after all this explanation, in actuality, the default settings in Audacity are going to be the best settings in most cases, unless you're working on a project that specifically needs to be at a higher sample rate. So I'm leaving the defaults of 44.1 and 32-bit float. I'll click OK. Now you can also set the sample rate of your current project from this menu down here in the lower left-hand corner. Now this will only affect the current project, and any new projects you create will still use the default settings in Preferences. Also, changing the sample rate here won't affect any tracks you've already recorded into this project or have imported into it. But it will apply to the files you export from this project. I'm just going to switch this back to 44.1 for now. Alright, so really, creating a new project in Audacity is very easy, but I also felt that it was important to know what's going on behind the scenes. Now before we wrap up this video, I want to look at one more thing, and that's how Audacity saves projects. I can't choose File, Save Project right now, because I haven't recorded or imported anything yet. So I'm just going to hit the record button for a few seconds to record a track. And I'll hit stop. And now I can choose File, Save Project. I get this warning telling me that choosing Save Project creates a file that can only be read by Audacity, and that if I want to save my audio as a file that can be read by other programs, to use the export command. But when you're working in Audacity, you really should save your work as a project. Otherwise, you can't save information like the number of tracks you're using, the position of the tracks in the mix, the volume levels and pan information, and so on. I'll choose not to see this warning again and click OK. For this project, I'm going to navigate to my desktop, and I'm going to create a folder to store my project into. I'll just call this My First Recording. And I'll name the project file itself My First Project. Notice this is being saved as a .aup file. You can see the file type here is an Audacity project. I'll click Save. And I'll just hide Audacity for a moment. Here's the folder I just created. Now there's a reason I created a folder to save this into. Notice there are two items here. There's myfirstproject.aup, which is the actual project file, and a folder called myfirstproject_data. The data folder contains, among other things, the actual sound files that make up your project. These two items in this main folder here are intrinsically tied together, so it's very important to make sure you never move these items away from each other. They should always remain in the same directory. That's why I suggest storing your project in sort of a master folder like I've done here, so the project file and its data folder are organized together. The only thing you ever want to do in here is double-click the project file if you want to open it up. You don't want to move these files around, you don't want to go into the data folder and move anything around in there, and you don't want to rename any of these items from here. If you do want to rename your project, you should open it in Audacity and then choose File, Save Project As to create a copy of it with the new name. So not following these rules can lead to some serious problems with your project. And really the only rule is don't mess with anything in the project folder. Now, one last thing related to the project file I should mention. In the previous chapter, when I showed you how to import audio, we saw that you can choose whether to make a copy of that file into your project or to read and use the file directly from its current location. And again, we saw those preferences under the Import-Export preferences. And I used the default setting here to make a copy of uncompressed audio files before editing. But if you choose the Read Uncompressed Audio Files directly from original option, you need to be sure never to move or rename that file unless you first copy it into the Audacity project. Alright, so this might seem like an awful lot of stuff to remember just to create and manage an Audacity project, but most of what I've covered here is behind-the-scenes stuff. At its most basic, creating a new project is just about choosing File, New. Once you've done that, you can adjust the sample rate and bit depth of your project if necessary, and then just name and save your project. All you really need to remember is to not mess with any of the project files outside of Audacity.